Sure. So I'm Chris Wells. I'm a social worker, a writer. Um, I study Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration. I'm the co-host of a podcast called Positive Disintegration. And yeah, I thought a lot when you asked me to do this about how I would talk about my journey or what's the most important thing or things plural to share about me. And it's hard to say, honestly, you know. At this point in my life, I'm so different than I was even 10 years ago or 20 years ago or longer. I'm going to be 50 this year in 2023. So, um, I've been doing a lot of reflection because I'm currently working on a book about how I came to study Dabrowski's theory and about my mentor, Michael Piechowski. And so, I've been in the past quite a bit because I'm a diarist. Like the writing that I've done the most in my life is really for myself. And I was thinking about that this morning, actually. Like it's weird to be a diarist. When I was young, I thought that something must be wrong with me as a writer because I wasn't writing for other people. I was so focused on just writing my observations and writing about myself and the people in my life. But there's nothing wrong with it. It's this is actually one of the interesting, I think, things about me and my journey is that for so much of my life, I assumed that there must be something wrong with me, or that I was an alien, that I was broken, that I wasn't what other people wanted me to be. And that caused me a lot of, I would say, pain when I was young.
Yeah. When you talked about the part about your being a diarist and what you know couple of artists, when they do the curation, they're, I don't know, I'm not an artist myself. They talk about all forms of art form, which probably includes writing diaries, is really a reflection of yourself. It's just in different ways. So whether it's art that people you hear artists that says, I just make art for myself. I don't care if other people like it or not. And then, there are other different types. But I thought that was really interesting when you sort of mentioned the diarist and sort of your, I guess, your perspective that, well, if you're writing, shouldn't it be for other people? And sometimes I wonder, like, when we do something, does it need to be for, I mean, could any reason be a good reason, or just because I want to as a good reason? So that's something I thought was really interesting. And I think your journey today, that, parts of your journey that you're willing to share with our audience, because you're also a podcast host, it's sort of today's the opposite, where you get to share sort of like, how did you, maybe how did you get on this journey? And it's really cool that you're talking about how, you're reflecting on how much you've changed, or kind of because of the past, sort of all the dots connecting. This idea of people, or the expectation that we need to be consistent is sort of kind of interesting when you talk about personality and growth, human growth over time. It's like, even just biologically, we're different every day. Just there, I'm not sure what we would call consistent, what is consistency over time. So that's kind of interesting to me.
It is interesting. Or like personality, that the idea that maybe it's set and you don't change very much in your life. I know that that's not true for me. I'm very different now, personality wise, compared to when I was younger. But that's actually one of the things that I discovered in Dabrowski's theory that resonated with me personally was the idea of transcending your psychological type or the biological life cycle. But for me, when I was younger, I was very extroverted, and I think that I genuinely was. I really found other people energizing. I enjoyed socializing. When I go back and read my journals from when I was in high school, I was just constantly with other people, would go out, with this person and then hang out with this person in the same day. And now I look back on that and I'm like, who was that? I now I can barely, meet with a couple people in a day without it taking a lot of my energy, and then I kind of have to recover from it. And so I that's like a that's quite a deep change to go through in your life, to go from being very extroverted to being introverted.
Yeah. So that's, you just reminded me of a conversation I had with my son between my two children. They're teenagers now. My younger son, who's twice exceptional. Most people who know him would be, oh, he's the social child sort of within our family. And it was interesting. That's what I thought too. But what was different with him is that depending on where what is going on in his environment, I don't always see that side of him. So it makes me wonder if do we always have certain sides of us that, because of the interaction with our environment, it brings out certain pieces of us that may for other people feel like you're very different, but they are genuine sides of us. It's just that if we're often in a environment that's sort of more consistent, that consistency not in ourselves necessarily, but in our environment and sort of what's going on, perhaps brings out certain aspects of us that comes across as if it's consistent, but who knows, right? I mean, that's, I think, part of the intrigue. My interest is always in sort of what's going on inside and what's being expressed externally. Sort of, is it at in alignment or is that not in alignment? And sort of, are we even aware sometimes of what we're doing? Is that, sort of that piece of, which is very abstract, I guess, is sort of something I always wondered about.
Well, that's a good question. I think about that a lot. Are my actions congruent with my values? Am I masking? Am I being my authentic self in this situation? I mean, I think about that quite a bit, and it's a topic that comes up with people that I work with, and a variety of settings. I would say is this idea that, um, I think for so many of us, we spend a significant amount of our lives masking and, kind of just being who we think other people want us to be so that we can fit in or be a part of, some social life. But, at this point in my life, I'm trying really hard to be authentic and to make sure that I am, in integrity with myself. And that's not easy to do, because you have to be prepared to disappoint people if you're going to be authentic. And it's hard to disappoint people, especially when you know that you're letting them down. Even it's the holidays got that on my mind, because for me, like I just said, I find socializing to be tough at this point, and yet that's something that's kind of an expectation of the holiday season, to spend time with other people. And I don't always love doing that, except that usually if I can get myself out of the house and go do it, then I'm glad that I did it, which, this year that's how it went. So that's nice.
Yeah. So from what you're saying, it sounds like the maybe the evaluation or the conclusion of that is retrospective, which means at the moment, even if we feel like, oh, I don't want to do it, then I wonder if we're able to find ways to overcome that, to get to closer to the conclusion part, that perhaps then looking backwards, we may, like what you said, oh, I'm glad I did go in the end.
Right.
On there. And so I wonder if maybe it's sometimes more of our own expectation as to what the future holds that's holding us back. Because we have, even if we try to be open, I think it's difficult to go into any situation without knowing at all what are the possibilities. In fact, for
That's
me,
right.
that bothers me more than knowing. If I'm entering a situation, the not knowing piece bothers me is more anxiety inducing than knowing I'm going into something bad that I have no choice in, or going to something good. Like that not knowing is something that for me personally is the most sort of like the worst thing that could happen is not knowing. But knowing it's bad is better
Totally.
than not knowing anything.
I agree. I don't like fear. I have that fear of the unknown. I don't like going into something just not knowing anything about how it's going to go. All my life, I've been kind of somebody who needs to have some degree of rehearsal, and what comes to mind here is like, starting in a new college, starting in a new job, just kind of going, where am I going to park? Where's my building? Needing to know ahead of time, like what I'm going to be expected to do. I like preparation to some degree.
Yeah.
And my
Has
son
that
does too. That's a huge, it's something that I've been able to do for him because that's how I am too. And it's definitely something I've, seen in him as well.
yeah. So what you said, my son who's Christian, who's 14, he's almost 15. And what I noticed for him is that, we've had conversations where rationally we would reason things out. And then, we would both agree, like, up, that makes sense. And then we go to the end. I'm like, okay, so would you go? He's like, no. Even though
Right.
rationally, right? We're sort of in agreement, whatever it is. So it tells me then that, our rational reasoning part and our emotions, because that seems to be, rationally we're like, reason by logic and reason, we're all on the same page. But his emotional reaction to the, okay, so are we doing it or not, is in his case, you know, overriding a lot of the logic pieces. And it really doesn't seem to be in the moment any way to sort of uh, use logic to sort of help regulate the emotional pieces. So it's been really interesting because a lot of times, we think that, so you see the evidence, so therefore we should all do it. And then, obviously that's easier said than done. And that piece of it is really intriguing to me. It sort of brings me to the point of the emotional safety, how important sort of the other pieces that most people don't focus on, or they focus on, especially if you have high abilities. It's like, well, you can reason it out, therefore you should it,
Oh my
it
gosh. I've heard that so much in my life when I was younger. You should know better. Like you're a smart kid. You should know better than this. And I would be like, this isn't something, yeah, exactly what you said. I mean, often I have I'm such an emotional person that just it often derailed my thinking when I was young. It can still to some degree, even in adulthood, but it's different now. But when I was young, I was usually really shut down because my emotions were so overwhelming that I just couldn't deal with them.
were you aware of your emotions, or was it more on automatic mode?
Yeah, I was not aware of them. I mean, I experienced them strongly, but I was um often angry, kind of aggressive, self-protecting when I was young, for a variety of reasons. But I just had such a strong experience of emotions that I found them overwhelming. And so often I would just shut it down or like live in anger because it was easier than realizing that I was experiencing pain or suffering in my life. I think that that's a big part of why I started writing. Or I mean, I think, I know that that's why I started writing. My first journal that I started when I was 16 was absolutely from this book that I had been reading called When Anger Hurts. My therapist had suggested to me that I was very angry and that this was like something for us to work on. But I went right to the bookstore and started looking at self-help books for anger. And one of them, this book, I just remember it was called When Anger Hurts. said that you could write a journal and kind of pay attention to your anger throughout the day, rate it on a scale of like 1 to 10. And so I started doing that. And it was maybe within a week or so that I stopped like using it as an anger journal, but I kept writing. And I just recognized right away, oh yeah, like when I put my thoughts down on paper, then I can go back and see what I was thinking, see what happened. It just opened up a whole new world of self-awareness and ability to it didn't necessarily work right away to help deal with my anger, be less explosive. I mean, I can say that it didn't because just a couple weeks after I started that anger journal, I got kicked out of high school. I was like, I had done a few questionable things, and they were all from anger. So it's definitely something that I struggled with when I was young. Now I still have moments where, I mean, just this month I had an experience of getting really angry over something, and I know that I shocked some people in my life with just how upset I was, and just unleashed a little bit of that anger that I lived in when I was a kid.
Yeah. So I wonder when, you know, I think there are people are wondering, including myself, when we talk about people, I guess, I like to think about all of us, we have different variability. And when you are more extreme in your variability, if we kind of maybe convert it into what we're currently talking about, like giftedness or twice exceptionality, it's that wider range in the variability is how I kind of um, view it, or visualizing it. The question is that when you have a wider variability qualitatively, does it change into something else? Because when we're thinking sort of like, if we're thinking like, I don't know, like let's say if we're all a certain type of plants, and then if you're more variable, just taking that for example, that you're just saying, oh, that plant is taller than this other plant. That to me is still the same thing, just variability in a different way versus I don't know what it is, but I do wonder all the time, are we even using the right metaphor? Perhaps we're all different plants, but different species of plants. So that's a different way to even look at it. Then we're all a certain type of plant, but just, they grow at different speed. We could grow at different speeds. The reason why this came up was because recently, so my husband and I are from Singapore. So there are a few tropical, like chili plants are notorious. It'll just die, any sort of cold, it just dies and then you just replant them. So I've been trying to grow this chili in winter here in Texas. Not going to happen outside. So we decided, hey, we're going to do it in the bathroom, the artificial light. So, over Thanksgiving, we came back and then we came back again. It just because it's in the bathroom. So if you need to use the bathroom, you will see the plants. It's like in the way. You have to go through there. So what was interesting to me, I was like, oh, just taking a look at it. I'm like, oh, this, they all in the same soil, pretty much same water, right? Same light. And they were growing at different speeds, the same species of, from the same pack of seeds or whatever. And it was intriguing to me because the ones that grew earlier when we came back in when we came back for NAGC during that time in November, and this time they were not the same plants, they were the same height. So they didn't continue growing at that rapid speed from before. So I noticed, I'm like, oh, wait a minute, the plant before that looked like it was growing at a, very rapid pace, now it's like, oh, now that's the shortest one, now with time. So that really, makes me wonder when we talk about all of these things, especially within education, when we talk about student identification, whether you're gifted or not, we're really looking at a slice in time. But then how do you really know until you kind of look at more slices in time, like at least just using the plant example, when I came back, looking back at this moment when I came back, I would have identified the different plants that were taller. If the being tall, like being an outlier, is sort of the criteria for being a certain thing, like being more gifted because somehow, it's able to grow faster given the same ingredients. That's so different than a month ago. A month ago, whichever plant I would have identified as, oh, that must be a gifted plant because it's like, growing so rapidly. And now it'd be like, wait a minute, that's totally different. It's sort of, that's how, that's some of the thoughts I have about humanity. Like when we look at people, it almost seems like it's really difficult to see in the moment. For some, especially when you have the a lot of the extremities kind of interacting with each other, that it's sort of over time that it's the time aspect that maybe gives you a little bit more clues as to, what's going on, what could be going on, especially if for like someone like my son, he tends to go inward. So there's no way we could read minds, at all. And perhaps he often says, like, I can't even explain. I don't have words for what I'm feeling, which is very interesting to me. He doesn't journal, but his expression of what's going on inside is qualitatively is so different when it's on like what he would consider, he likes to do messy art, than as a way to express himself, than words or anything like that. And I could see that struggle because a lot of times when we try to be really precise, a lot of words that are called synonyms, they're really not. If you really kind of, otherwise they'll be the same. Like, why would we have two words? I mean, sort of that qualitative differences is something I wonder about, on there.
Yeah, that's you reminding me of my son a bit too. I mean, he's really an internalizer. He um doesn't talk a lot. It's kind of hard to know what he's thinking unless he chooses to share it with you. Um and yeah, I was an externalizer when I was young. I was very explosive, in your face. I think that I was a real puzzle because I was perceived as being very gifted, but my behavior did not match people's expectations of what it meant to be very gifted, And so I didn't make sense to people. But for sure, looking back on my story, one of the most important things that helped me, survive, I would say, is that I had a lot of supportive relationships with people who were there for me, adults and age peers. And so, I do believe that having like um, so many supportive relationships was important for me. I'm somebody who is very relational in how I do everything and who I am. And so, um, that's another area though where my son is very different from me. He hasn't had that experience of having like the same number or quality of relationships that I was blessed to have when I was young. And I think that sometimes it feels like something that I've failed at as a parent to not provide him that same, like rich social life that I had when I was young. But I mean, these things they're so individual and variable that it's something that I can't like blame myself for, but I wish that he had.
Is it, I always wonder, so more of not what the situation is, but sort of our feelings about it. For some, they're like, it's totally fine, it doesn't bother
Right. Yeah,
me, sort of
exactly.
like we're more bothered as parents because we have maybe in relation to what we had before or what we wish we had. We sort of, we have, we want to make sure that we provide, especially if it's something we didn't have, and also something we felt that was very helpful that we would love for our children to have. And I wonder if sometimes maybe if we really take a really brutally honest look at ourselves, we're wondering, am I doing it because that was something I missed that I really wish I had. That's why or is it something really that I I think that my son would really enjoy from him as a person and sort of, and I think those are really difficult things when we try to, I had contemplated maybe possibly needing to homeschool him. We've never actually done it because every time we attempt to we used to do Sunday Chinese classes and at that, during that time, I was definitely able to help with, with the class in terms of the content. But that was so, you know, that was so damaging to our relationship, parent-child relationship, that I was like, okay, what is the thing that are non-negotiable? Being a teacher, other people could be a teacher or his teacher too, even mentor, but being his parent, being his mother, I, I don't think that's something I could really sub out to somebody else doing if I wanted to. So when it became um, so contentious, I had to really take a step back and go, you know what, we're just gonna have to, even though I could teach it for sure, just have other people do it because it was getting in the way of our relationship. And things were a lot better once I was able to. Really, it was more me than him. He was like, I already told you. Like in his mind, he was like, maybe somebody else should teach him how to do that. But I had to kind of get over my own whatever other feelings around sort of like, oh my God, if I could do it, why, sort of like being really clear what my roles were. And sometimes you can't be the 2 or 3 or 4 things all at once because they kind of conflict each other. And things were so much better, and it almost became, if I go, oh, I'm going to try to teach him something, his reaction, which is, his reaction is he's already reacting to the previous version of me, where it's really difficult to even, even though I've changed, I felt like that barrier is natural. I don't think it's on purpose. It's just like the reaction to his prior experience really got in the way too, on there. So it's sort of, really interesting that way. Yeah. So have you continued to journal since you were 16?
Yeah, I've been writing since I was 16. And so I have, an enormous amount of text, like millions of words that I've written. Even just over the past several years, I've written millions of words. So,
Do you
or
go
more than a million anyway.
do you go through certain periods where you might write more, or is it part of like your
Yeah.
practice where you want to you set time aside to whatever comes, or is it more
Well, I mean, it's
organic?
changed over time. When I was younger, I wrote a lot in high school. Um, and, during my first couple years of college, it diminished a bit because I was like more social and active at school. But I still wrote. But then there were times like when I was really struggling, like the first like huge period of disintegration that I went through when I was like 20 and 21. I didn't write very much. And so, especially like, when I think back to like 1994 as an example of a year, I was 21. I had made 2 suicide attempts. I ended up in the hospital. I wrote very little that year. And so it's too bad in a way because I wish that I had written more about what I was going through, but I didn't, because I was like suffering so much that I wasn't able to write. And so there's times like that. And then I came back from that and wrote a lot over the next like 5 years, say, when I was really trying to, I mean, I was seeing it as I was trying to recover and get back to where I was, but that's not what really happened. I think that well, I wouldn't want to go down this path right now, but I have a real issue with the idea of recovery from, you know, mental illness because, you know, I believe that I really came out at a higher level than I was. It's not like I returned to some state where I had been. I became a new person and a different person. And so, writing helped me get there. But then I went through another period when I was in undergrad where like as an adult, like I was a returning student, where I didn't write so much just because I was a full-time student. I was so busy. And so I just, writing sometimes fell by the wayside there. But over, I don't know, I would say the past, well, actually, I can say for sure. I mean, so in January 2023, it'll be 5 years that I've written every day, and I've never missed a day, in the past 5 years. So it's become certainly a practice for me. And at this point, I feel that writing is a meditation for me, but it's also a method of inquiry. Writing for me is so much more at this point in my life than just what I think and what I'm going through day to day. It's also what I'm reading and what I'm thinking and this theory that I study and the people that I'm dealing with. And it's become a lot more than it was.
So, as you were talking, there's so many different pathways we could go down, but I was like, oh, for anyone listening that's not familiar with Dabrowski, this is probably a good time for you to maybe share a little bit, because this isn't specific to that, but because I think his theory features impacts you so greatly, and you happen to bring it up. I think this is a good time to share a little bit about maybe from your perspective, what is the theory about, and maybe a couple of things that most people who don't know much about the theory, other than having heard about it, sort of like the myth, and sort of maybe a couple of the
Right.
major sort of myth correcting segments would be awesome.
Sure. I think the most succinct way of explaining what Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration is that it's a theory of inner transformation. I mean, that's what he was interested in. That's what the theory describes. And that's what struck me about it. And I think that really, like, since this is about, you know, my story and my journey, the best way to describe it is in some ways to say, like, so when I came to Dabrowski's theory, it was in 2014, and I was working on this autoethnography. I had discovered autoethnography as a research method, and I was like, oh my gosh. I mean, as a diarist, especially, I thought, oh, well, I've been studying my life since I was a kid. Like, this is a natural methodology for me. And so I jumped right in, even though I was supposed to be working on my dissertation. I put my dissertation on hold, and it's because I had gone through a crisis in my family. My aunt had died, and I discovered that my cousin, who was the same age as me, was dying. And it just, like, all of that loss just prompted me to go into the past and search for answers. And also at that time, my son, we had to pull him out of school to kind of emergency homeschool him. We discovered he was twice exceptional. And again, like, all of this just really caused me to go inward and look for answers. So all of that was happening when I discovered Dabrowski's theory. But also, what's important to understand is that at that point, even though I knew when I was a kid that I had been gifted, right, and like highly gifted, this was not terminology I had retained in adulthood. I was not, as an adult, I never thought, well, I'm a gifted adult. Like, it, that word just didn't stick with me in adulthood. I saw myself as mentally ill. And so when I discovered the theory, it was from this perspective of trying to go, like, I was rediscovering my giftedness because of my son. And all of a sudden, I discovered Dabrowski's theory in this chapter from Michael Piechowski, and it blew me away because the chapter that I was reading was called Emotional Giftedness, the Measure of Intrapersonal Intelligence. And he's talking about these things that I had always assumed were mental illness with this terminology of emotional giftedness and overexcitabilities. And I have to be honest that at first I really just rejected that because I thought, well, this is euphemistic bullshit. Like, there's no way that these things that I've always seen as mental illness are positive. No way. But that was so, just knowing that there was an alternative, though, like, opened up this crack in me that allowed me to slowly explore, like, the possibility that I wasn't really mentally ill, and that I had been deeply misunderstood and had deeply misunderstood myself for so many years. But so Dabrowski, I mean, he was a psychiatrist and a psychologist. And so the theory was based on his clinical practice and experience and the research he did as a clinician. Um, he saw that people who experience life very intensely, like, the overexcitabilities are pretty well known in gifted land. Uh, but they came from nervousness. And so it's much broader than just gifted. They're not just characteristics of giftedness, the overexcitabilities. They are also a part of different kinds of neurodivergence, like ADHD or autism. And so when I discovered the theory, it was seeing myself as ADHD, and having bipolar disorder and lifelong struggles with anxiety. Well, I realized after discovering the theory that I am not bipolar. Like, bipolar disorder was a misdiagnosis for me. I do believe that I'm an ADHDer, but uh, you know, who it's hard to say, like, who knows exactly precisely what my diagnosis should be. Well, I don't care anymore because I have this theory that helps make sense of my life. I mean, he saw that if you have these overexcitabilities, you're more likely to experience positive disintegration, which is really a breakdown of your ego and who you think you are. It's like a crisis of personality, at least in our terms of personality. Like, for Dabrowski, you don't personality is an achievement and something that you create. It's like a self-created, self-directed personality ideal. But in our 21st century idea of personality, it's different. You know, it's even like what I described when I was younger. I had these beliefs about myself, like I'm outgoing, I'm extroverted. Like, I had all of these ideas of who I was. And then there was a crisis, like I said, when I was like 20, when I started rethinking so many aspects of myself. And part of it was that I had this strong imaginational experience where I kind of experienced life in multiple tracks at the same time. And I had like huge confusion over who I really was. And I didn't know who I was. And all of that led to this moment where I decided to try and kill myself rather than, keep living. And then I did it again. And like, it felt often when I was younger, like life was so difficult and overwhelming that I would rather be dead than have to keep doing it. So, in my 20s, I spent years in and out of mental health treatment, with different providers, in and out of the hospital on a huge variety of medications, trying to figure things out. But it was really when I moved away from psychiatry and I moved away from medication that I was able to figure it out myself. And this was really like, these dynamisms that Dabrowski talked about in action. The dynamisms come from overexcitabilities. And so again, like, there's that connection with having this intense experience of life in these different forms, and that creates the actual processes that help you like move through the pain that you're going through. But you have to, uh, there has to come a time when you like accept like where you are in the moment, say, this is what I'm working with. And, also I would say have a vision of who you want to be and where you're going, and until you have that idea of where you're going, it's hard to get there. So I feel like that wasn't the best explanation of positive disintegration, but it's kind of my personal one and on my journey. And so, if you think about it, like if we're going into 2023, I discovered the theory in 2014. It's been almost 9 years now of knowing about it, but it took me a solid year, I would say, after discovering it before I was willing to explore it in depth um and that's when I started the real investigation of, was this a misdiagnosis? Why am I still taking medication for bipolar disorder? It was time to like rethink everything in my mental health history. And so at this point, it's been several years since I've taken medication at all, but I did kind of step away. I stepped down, over time. First, I went off the bipolar meds, then I stopped taking medication for anxiety and ADHD, and I don't feel like I need it anymore. I am, I would say, more well than I've ever been. But I also, like I said, write every day. I have a meditation practice. I've worked really hard to be healthy.
Yeah. Like
And I would
that.
say that there's like a spiritual health there too. It's not just mental health, it's not just my physical health. It's a balancing of all of these aspects of myself. And it's not to say that I'm fully imbalanced right now. I mean, it's a lot to manage, having a lot of relationships and a lot of work to do. I just do the best I can.
Yeah. Um, that kind of brings me to I met somebody and he said that he found out that for him what was meditative, meaning allowing his mind body to sort of be in a state of calmness, was listening to rock music, which I was like, okay, that's usually not what you would think of when you think about meditative sort of methods. But he found that that worked because he was able to focus on the beat, like the bass beat, and sort of let that carry him through. And it was fascinating when I heard him say that. So in other words, find our own way of what helps our mind body to calm down. It doesn't, it could be any way, sort of,
That's right.
especially if you've tried a lot of different things that people tell you, sort of maybe like, whatever it is, continue finding your own way. It's really what works for you. It's the criteria should be what works for you, and not necessarily maybe what other people are telling you or what works for other people, because we're all different.
Totally.
So,
Well, and especially like in, excuse me, in the gifted space, you know, if you're intellectually gifted, you need a certain amount of mental stimulation. I mean, that's just, it's kind of a given with this population. And so that's going to be very different for different people. Like for me, obviously it's writing, it's getting these words on paper. Um, but like that's, I would never, I can't like recommend to other people like this is the way forward for you, because it's so individual. It's
yeah,
really, but I mean, I think that for some gifted people, like this is what they're missing. Like if you have never realized that there are certain commonalities about being gifted, like this need for mental stimulation, if no one's clued you into the fact that your giftedness gives you a different kind of inner experience than somebody who's more typically developing, then you're at a real loss by the time you hit adulthood. Or you're like a step behind where you need to be, because these are important aspects of yourself that you need to know about. Unfortunately, even though we have a field of gifted education, it hasn't been very successful at translating this information into knowledge that's shared with young people. In fact, a lot of people who, are gifted, they weren't even told about it when they were kids, or this is something that they had to figure out in adulthood. And so, like, this is something that I'm personally interested in. Like, how do we do a better job of educating young gifted people about what it means to be gifted, what the challenges are, along with the blessings of it? Because I feel like I was kind of failed as a kid by being told, oh, you're very gifted. Like I had very high IQ scores. Like I was a high achiever when I was young. Then I was an underachiever. And then when I was an underachiever, it was like an emergency. What's wrong with you? Are you broken? Like, but nobody ever talked about what it meant to be gifted, like beyond test scores and what I was doing in the classroom. This was a real problem. It led me to think that there was something wrong with me, because I have a very different experience of reality compared to the norm. This has always been apparent to me. Well, I took it to mean that there was something wrong with me. I looked for answers in psychiatry. I am not unusual. I know now because of the work I do that this is very common for people to be like, oh, I'm so different from everybody else. It must mean that there's something wrong with me. Maybe there's answers in the DSM.
right. Yeah,
Well, I don't know what it's going to take to fix this problem in the gifted world, where we're doing a better job of making this clear and getting this information out there. And it's part of what I hope to do with the podcast. And of course, we're having this conversation now, which helps.
Yeah. I think what's seems to be, and that was the case for me. So, just sharing my personal experience when we found out, oh, my son's twice exceptional. First thing I'm like, oh, what is that? And then after that, you go kind of, like, oh, let me go find out all the things I could find out about it. Then you go attend, everything under the sun whenever somebody has a conference or whatever, you go attend it. But you know, but I spent so much time listening to what the experts are telling me when they're also missing their expertise as a researcher is very different because, we're specifically interested in specific aspects. And in order to learn deeply about something like that, we sort of often study it in isolation. For example, I don't know, executive functioning, for example, because we're trying to gain knowledge about it as a thing by itself. But human beings are not just one. We're really a mixture of all of those. And it's not knowing just the thing itself or things, the different pieces of us, is not sufficient, because how the pieces interact is really what changes it. So even if you know a lot about the individual pieces, how it interacts, the interactional pieces of it, for everyone, it seems to be different. And it really does take that, the knowledge piece, and then your own, your the person or people that are close to what's happening daily, to look at the person as a whole, to figure that out. And I wonder if we could get the message that is, it is important to have enough knowledge, because if you don't know enough knowledge to ask the right questions or ask questions, then you don't even know what's out there to ask. There should be a balance between that and also, when you're trying to help your individual family or yourself, you are the one that possess, like what you said, you're the only one that kind of know what happened before, all your experiences, and all the different pieces of it. And it's sort of that we tend to maybe overlooked, really how much we can contribute ourselves if we're talking about our own journey, because you know more than other people, sort of your own experiences of all the different pieces that happen over time, and sort of that thinking about it, and having the safe space and time. Sometimes we just don't have time to sort of like think about, let all of those things kind of, kind of work around in your head. Sometimes it's unconscious, but where I think we're always, when there's a mystery, we're always working on it, whether it's conscious or not. And I like to see it as, if you see a painting, and if you only describe a painting that have white spaces and black, colored spaces, if we're only describing the white spaces or only the colored spaces to somebody else that doesn't see that painting, you're not going to get the whole picture, because any picture is made up of what's drawn in and the white spaces that makes the whole picture. So I think what you're talking about, when people kind of focus on the intellectual pieces of the high achieving and all that, and sort of missing out the psyche, like our lived experiences, our emotional reactions to how we all experience things differently, or could be similar. I don't know. For each one of us, it's the interaction of those two parts of it that really creates the whole person. And it seems like we're within education, because it's really hard to obviously measure all those other things we talked about. It's easier to measure that achievement piece, like what can you produce? What do we see on the outside? At the same time, what we don't see on the outside, what we see, unless you're saying what we see on the outside is equivalent to what's inside, which I think most of us agree it's not the same. We're missing that big, it's like half the picture is missing, on there. And it's sort of
Right.
I wonder
Well,
if,
half the picture is missing. I mean, it's so
yeah,
true because, well, this is
what,
an ongoing problem. I mean, it's not a mystery. Like it's been decades in this field of gifted education of people like openly denying the experience of giftedness as a meaningful psychological difference. That it, I mean, they argue that it doesn't even exist or it's not even true or it's invalid. Like there's a huge amount of invalidating that goes on in this field because it's so polarized between people who believe that gifted children actually exist and people who only want to talk about developing talent and the achievement model. We haven't done a good job of bringing it together and looking at the whole child or the whole individual. Part of the problem too is the focus on children because it's gifted education. I mean, there's no equivalent area in psychology where they're looking at giftedness. I mean, or they're only looking at intelligence and again, measurable, achievement. Like there are huge gaps that need to be addressed and dealt with, but that just aren't. I mean, I could, I mean, we could have like a whole, we could talk about this for, hours. Like this is a
yeah,
real problem. I don't know how to solve it. I mean, one of my goals moving forward is to do a better job of bringing what we've learned about the gifted outside of gifted education, not preaching to the choir, going to social workers, psychologists, counselors, other fields, and talking about these experiences and trying to liberate it from the world of education where there's not enough emphasis or discussion on the experience and the psychological aspects of giftedness.
yeah. Like even talking about, if we talk about not just giftedness, my son is twice exceptional and he's autistic. A lot of, the stereotypical, most people would be like, they, you know, um, general public would have things like, oh, they don't understand emotions because they,
Oh,
and
right. Or they lack
or
empathy.
sort of
Yes.
like sort of again, there are wider knowledges. My personal experience is that between my two children, so one's twice exceptional, one isn't, both are highly gifted, is that my son is more human to me, really, than all of us, because he just seems to feel deeply about things.
Mhm.
In fact, I wonder if it's that sort of what appears on the outside as being very sort of remote is just is an unconscious way of adapting to something that's too much. When it's too
Right.
much, you kind of, right, like if something's too hot, you're going to remove yourself from hot water that's too hot. You're not going to still stay in there. That would not make sense. So if we look at it from an adaptability, sort of natural, your body is and mind and body and brain is trying to assist you, the person, to adapt to what's going on. If we look at it through that lens, I think that's a very different interpretation of behaviors, whether it's negative behavior or positive behavior, because then all behaviors, if you interpret it that way, we see it as it's a way for that person, individual, that organism to adapt to the environment or what is being imposed on, on the person. And I think being able to be open to consider a view like that, just like what you said, sort of like it just gives us more a broadening and widening of what options there are out there. So if you think of a pathway, right, if you can't even see a pathway, you're not even going to consider it because it doesn't exist. But if we're able to um, open up or be broadened or be open to considering, at least, even maybe not that you have to do it, but to consider that, oh, well, perhaps there's this other way to look at it. I think that already exist additional pathways, whether we take it or not. I think is sometimes we're at different, we need to be ready to go on that journey. but at
Mhm.
least we can now see different pathways where then we have more, it feels like we have more alternatives to choose from if we can.
Right.
And I think looking at his behaviors from an adaptability point of view, for me was very helpful, but it also really explains like, oh, that totally would make sense because I'm not him, so I wouldn't know what he's experiencing. But now that he's older, as he's getting older, we're more able to sort of have these conversations to help tease out sort of, oh, what's going on in his mind, where he would, he, I think one time, he has very sensitive hearing, and it's not, and here's the thing that's puzzling. Um, he has very sensitive hearing, and yet, for example, currently his passion is into planes. They are very loud. I mean, no one would say they're not loud. So when we are out there at an air show, I'm the one that really has to like cover my ears almost because it's that loud. He's not bothered by it. So it's a lot more complicated than we even think about, because he has sensitive hearing, but when it's a passion area, somehow that doesn't seem to be, maybe that input is stimulating in a good way and not sort of in a bad way. So until we've kind of experienced all these, I'm like, wait, but that doesn't bother you? He's like, no. I'm like, because he could tell. He's like, well, he needed to hear what type of plane or whatever. To me, they all sound
Right.
apparently they're not. So it's sort of interesting. And yet sometimes I remember when he was younger, we went somewhere like a House of Rock or something, and we were kind of near the base, and he covered his ears. And I was like, oh, that was like during a friend's bar mitzvah party or something like that. And I was like, oh, no, don't do that. But, he was just covering something that was maybe too much for him.
Right.
And he wasn't able to express that that's too much. That's why I'm doing it. But sort of, that was
Right.
way early in our journey. And, I did recall saying, oh, don't do that. That's rude, kind of thing. And instead of him, because he needed to protect himself, in some way, it's just too much. So those are something I hope maybe having that wider conversation about, looking at all behaviors as whether it's negative or not, I mean, perceived as negative or not, is those are clues that something's going on, that
Right.
I see it as clues, not in any good or bad way, but sort of those are clues as to what's going on inside us. That the assumption is that, and I think somebody, was it Ross Green who said that, like, if we can, we all would.
That's
So
right.
if we
Kids
are,
do well if they can.
yeah. So more about that, if they are misbehaving, it's not because they choose to, it's because they're trying, whether it's conscious or not, it's clues as to something's going on, that there's some suffering going on inside that's
That's right.
being manifested as the way to cope is sort of, that's their expression of how to cope with what's going on inside. And it
Right.
sounds
And
really
behavior is communication.
yes. So it's just like, I don't know how we know, but sort of, in fact, I wonder, like with our pets, how do we know what they're thinking? I mean, we don't even have language, but somehow I mean,
That's
if you
right.
think about it, like, why aren't we giving the same amount of care and thought to the non-verbal communication? It's sort of, just because we can speak now, we're expected to be able to like just say everything. But if you think about your pets, like, we're just so much more, I guess, open or willing or patient to be like, let's figure out what they're doing with that. Because, I don't understand that barking. It almost seems like language gets in the way because we assume so much from language. And even between my son and I, even my husband, all of us, even the same words, people can interpret them so differently. And then it kind of leads us down different pathways, especially if you think very differently. The same, I mean, very often this is like a recurring theme within our family that, 5 minutes down or a couple minutes, I'm like, wait a minute, this conversation is getting weirder and weirder. Okay. It doesn't quite make sense. And then I'm like, wait a minute. And then I kind of roll back to like the initial whatever that started it. And then I'm like, what do you mean by this? Then found out, oh, he had a completely different, perfectly, acceptable kind of interpretation of the words, just not the, I guess, what I just assumed we would all be, understanding of whatever words. And I can't remember. It was very interesting to me. And then it almost seems like then, if I had gotten upset, like, why are you saying all this? That doesn't make sense. Or are you trying to be funny? It's not. He's really coming from understanding what I asked or the questions or the conversation in a very different way. And to him, they're all connected because that makes sense. But to me, I'm like, wait a minute, that's not what, just something was off. And, if I kind of latched on to more of just getting mad at him because he's bright, right? Like, don't you, we're not talking about something like heavy duty. It just ended up derailing the whole conversation. But now we just laugh at it. I'm like, well, that's interesting. I never thought, but it's just like, it's interesting interpretation. And that makes sense from, I could see that being a perfectly logical interpretation. And then we would go down the, thing like, well, most people don't think this way. And he's like, well, why? I'm like, I don't know why, but it's just that, which is another whole interesting question as to why is it that we would, things that come to us naturally when we hear certain things vary. And, anyway, sort of, interesting.
It's true.
On there. So what are some things that perhaps we could entice anyone that listens to this to perhaps go find out a little bit more? Is there an article or a resource that you would recommend for anyone that's sort of perhaps have heard of Dabrowski or perhaps not, or sort of like, yeah, I'm not sure what it is, like maybe a one introduction piece, because I think depending on what your interaction is with Dabrowski, it could go either way.
Yeah, at this point, the thing that I would recommend is the podcast. And if you don't listen to the podcast, we also have transcripts for the first, I want to say 9 episodes at this point, and we're doing them slowly. I mean, it's a lot of effort to transcribe and edit, and we're editing for readability. So,
yeah.
But yeah, like on the Dabrowski Center website, we have those transcripts available plus the audio. So we've, episode 1 is Welcome to Positive Disintegration. And it wasn't just to introduce us, Emma and I, as, hosts, but to introduce the concepts too, and to kind of introduce the theory. So that's a good place to start, I think. And there's a lot of resources too in our show notes from the podcast. And so that's kind of like the one-stop place at this point where I'm pointing people. But there certainly are books too. Living with Intensity is a good introduction to the theory, and it's also available on audiobook. And so those are good places to start. And I'm looking forward in 2023 to talking more about the connections with neurodivergence, broadening people's ideas of overexcitability away from just characteristics of giftedness. They should never have only been seen that way. These are, I am actually thinking about pitching a session for NAGC next year on like 5 things you think Dabrowski said, but he didn't. And it's, I have to like hat tip to Sheila Gallagher for that idea. But I think that she's right, that it's important to do a little bit of myth busting around the theory in gifted ed.
Yeah. And I think that's, my background and interest is in human development. So I really look at things more broadly about just humanity, like what makes us who we are. So my focus has never been on like gifted or, certain aspects. It's just with my own parenting, what I found helpful is that when you start thinking about human development using extreme outliers, that is a good way to sort of use any model or theory. It's a good way to test because if there's one instance that it doesn't explain who you are or how you become who you are, and outliers are good ways to test that, then it helps me to sort of think about, does it work for outliers? I think any theory tends to work or be more likely to work for, depending on how it's developed. But when you think about other theories that are really developed with the perspective of making sure that it also explains extreme outliers, to me, that's harder to do. But also if we are able to find ways, even gifted education or whatever, education in general, where we design for extreme outliers, then, it should, in theory, work for everyone that sort of falls within the two extremities. So that's what is interesting to me at this particular point that's related to Dabrowski, and because I'm really looking at what helps us explain who we are over time and not just in one slice of time. Because if that model theory doesn't explain who you are over time, then it's not a developmental theory. A lot of times people tend to use the word development very loosely. Like when we say human development, we're talking about you as a human being, the whole human being, how you develop. I think that's quite different from like a motivation development theory. You're talking about how motivation changes over time. That's fine, but that's not a person theory of a person that changes over time as a whole person. So those are something that I'm always intrigued about, but also very, it just feels like I just need a lot more knowledge about a lot more things to even kind of pull it together. And I wonder, for example, Elaine Aron's work on highly sensitive person could be all different aspects. They are all different aspects of who we are as a person, but I wonder how much of it overlaps. Some of what she's describing overlaps with, again, the ideas of overexcitabilities, the giftedness, and all the neurodivergent, sort of how we are. And at some point it will be fascinating if someone attempts to try to see how all of these models and thinking, how do they fit together within a painting, like what we talked about. Because I'm sure
there has been some, for sure, people have tried to put together Elaine Aron's work with Dabrowski, and there definitely is overlap. She just has a different perspective than he did on what it means to have this kind of sensory processing sensitivity, or this different experience, intense experience of reality. Overexcitability is like the outlier version of having this, but by not interpreting it through the lens of neurodivergence and not seeing that these diagnoses like ADHD or autism also have overexcitability, like at their root, has been a real problem in understanding what Dabrowski meant. And so, gosh, that's another whole rabbit hole to go down of, but it's really interesting to me. Like there's so much to all of this. And at Saying next summer, I am excited to talk about Dabrowski's theory as a developmental framework for the neurodivergent, because I like that broader umbrella than just talking about giftedness. It's so much more than that.
Yeah.
And it is, again, like it's about inner transformation. And I would say throughout your lifespan, it's not like that only happens once, I mean,
yeah.
But some people develop differently, more profoundly than others. And those are the cases that have been historically of interest to people who study this theory, like Michael Piechowski. And I think they're fascinating too. But, my interest is to not talk so much about, extremes in terms of like spiritual development and exemplars as to, how it can look like mental illness and the suffering that we see in people going through disintegration.
Yeah.
So, we all have our interests. But I like
That's
what you said too. Like, it reminded me of Michael talking about William James, who said that, the profounder examples are the ones that he was interested in studying. And I think it's true. Like, if we understand the outliers, it does help us, understand everybody and provide them a better environment. If we're talking about education, I'm thinking about, like, if you create classrooms that work well for autistic kids, I mean, they work well for other kids too.
Yeah, yeah. So that's sort of, I think, a very different approach to talking kind of back to education. It's a different approach because, historically, from what I understand, education was public mass education started out because of a need to produce factory workers. I think that's a very different goal and reason why long time ago public education started. And here we are now. And perhaps we need to go, okay, are we still in that sort of environment in having those needs? And if those needs are different from what we understand, based on the workplace and what companies want, the type of employees they want nowadays are very different from how mass education started out. It
Right.
almost feels as if and that's the part we talked about, that I was really bothered by, that misalignment on different parts of our lives, that there isn't any sort of collaboration between different people, maybe interested in different segments of our life. But as human beings, we have to go through all of that regardless. And it really does almost feel like when you go to the workplace, what you're being told at your workplace is just, throw out all the stuff from before because we're going to teach you our way anyway. Then, when you think about it, I'm like, well, then why am I then learning all the stuff that I wouldn't be using anyway? I don't know. I think, but sort of, people who do ask about that could lead us to have very different ways we react to that, because we want to know, like, why am I, time is precious. Like, I want to know, why am I doing it? Is it worth my time to do it? What's the reason for doing? Do I need it for the future? And I know that for my son, if he doesn't see the big picture, somehow all these smaller things, there isn't, he's trying to find the big picture to anchor all the sort of
Mhm.
kind of floating in his mind,
Right.
which is a very different way of learning. So it's really, I see him struggle quite a bit when teachers are like, don't worry about it. When we get there, you'll see it. We were just working on that one
Right.
piece. But he's like, but how, how does it fit? Like, he just doesn't know how. And because he doesn't know how it fits in the whole, it's almost like it's just, the information's there, but it's just lost in his, he has a hard time retrieving them because it doesn't go anywhere. It's just sort of floating around, and sort of that's a whole other thing there. And I think same thing, if we think about education to cater to all different ways of thinking and all that, then, that should give us strategies and tools as to how do we then, if the purpose is to give us the skill sets to be productive in our society, let's say, to produce something good on a societal level, then, you know, should we, I don't know, it's a question, right? Is everybody valued? Do we see everyone as a valuable resource, at least from an economic point for the society, or for whatever reason, people have different values, even though we're all humans? I don't know. I think a
Right.
lot of these are philosophical questions that
They
because
are, but this issue of values is at the crux of
they,
what Dabrowski was talking about. It was all
yeah,
about values for him.
yeah, because that impacts what we do and what education's going to do, right? Where do we focus on? And, even though it sounds like such a, like, doesn't, but all those are, to me, starting points. It seems like we're at different starting points. And when we have variability in our different starting points, no matter how small, if you look at human beings are complex systems, we end up very, very far away when we scale it up. And education is an applied field many steps away from the philosophical, all those different pieces.
Right.
And it is just as important to really talk about these stuff. Like what is the purpose of education? Like, why are we doing it? And I mean, who are we doing it for? Do we value
Right.
every single person? Or I don't know the answer to that. All I'm saying is all those have huge implications in terms of then what would make sense fall into place. And, that might be something we may want to also maybe start having conversations about. Like, should everybody be, I mean, is it a human right that we should all be valued? Like we can definitely
Right.
find, I don't know.
Yes, I
If
would
it's
argue
important.
yes.
But that's a conversation to have, I it may sound like everybody should think that way, but I don't really know until we have that conversation, like,
Well, it's true. I mean, we face things like racism and ableism in our society, and it comes through in school too. And so until we really, examine our values and these issues, I don't know how we can make progress. Like what you were saying earlier, I think that we're so hampered by stereotypes in some ways of these issues that we're talking about: giftedness, neurodivergence, the different kinds. Well, there's so many stereotypes around these things. Until we break out of like these broader stereotypes to really examine what we're talking about, and like from a fresh examination of it, I just don't know how we're going to make progress. But
yeah,
it's overwhelming to think about making like big systemic change like we need to.
yeah,
All we can do is really work on ourselves and let it kind of radiate from there to the people around us, and try to improve, on a broader, bigger scale from there.
yeah. It
But
just
it's
takes,
hard to be patient. It can be very frustrating.
yeah. But, I just try to be positive, as in, every day that we make any positive change, over time. And if we share our views with some other people that maybe don't have not been are not aware of it, I think that's kind of how we try to, because it's, when you think about so much to do with so little time, it just gets sort of too much, to do it.
Right.
But if we just do whatever we can and just share whatever we can and talk to somebody that are not familiar at all, I think that's something doable that we can all say, okay, we could, kind of share this with somebody else that might be more open to listen to it. And that's actually really powerful, because if you think about it from a network theory, that organic spreading,
Mhm.
what that way of doing it is very doable. It doesn't cost each one of us like, a ridiculous amount of time. We're all sort of spreading the load, and it's but the additive, when we accumulate and add all of that together, those could be very powerful too, to make
Yeah,
change. So at
that's
all
right.
levels. So we'll just try whatever we can. And thank you so much, Chris. It's always a pleasure. We're looking forward to seeing you at the various different conferences, including SANG for sure. And
Mhm.
thank you for sharing your journey. And I usually will do a little blog, so I'll include the links and recommendations for any of our readers. And
Well, thanks so much for inviting me. I really am honored that you had me come and have this conversation with you. And so thank you so much, Lynn. I appreciate you.
no problem. And like I said, I'm interested in the human journey, right? So everyone's story is very interesting to me on there.
Me
All right.
too.
Thanks, Chris. Hang on.
Thank you.